Early in 2020, Leica brought the new Summilux 90mm f1.5 aspherical lens to market. I personally think this lens is magic in many ways, and that's why I decided to review the lens and show people on my channel what this lens is capable of. I mounted the lens on my Leica M10 Monochrom, which I think is enhancing the special effect or the magic this lens is bringing into photos, because everything is in black and white. I'm not going to shoot portraits, but also street, and that's very special with 90mm. Let's get started with the video. So in that little intro time-lapse at the beginning, I of course didn't show what's all in the box here, and the box is a very fancy box. Like always, the packaging is nice when it comes from Leica. So here's some manual, which is inside the box. Then we have here a leather pouch that's for the lens storage, if you want to go on travel and don't have it mounted on the camera. Then we have something else here. That is a tripod mount. So the lens has a separate tripod mount, so because the lens is very heavy, you can mount this on the lens and then this one goes into the tripod. So that's also very nice. You can argue whether it's necessary to have this in a fancy leather pouch like this, because you pay for all of that, but in general I think it's good to have it in that way. There is a lens cap here coming with it, because the lens cap which was originally on the lens is a metal one, and this is a plastic one which I already have mounted on the lens. I come to that in a second. And then there was a very fancy box, you saw that in the time lapse, where the lens is actually shipped with, and that's the metal cap you have on the lens, but I used the much, let's say, less valuable plastic cap here, which is mounted on the lens. So that's actually the lens here, very beautiful. I've mounted this on my Leica M10 Monochrom because I'm going to shoot today, and I will go for portrait, I will go for street, and shooting 90mm on street is a very interesting experience, I can tell you. And I come to that in a moment when we look into pictures and taking photos. The lens itself is beautiful, like always with Leica. You have a very smooth zoom ring here, you have an aperture ring with that nice click I love so much, and then you have a lens hood which you can just twist and then it's on top of it. So it's a built-in lens hood. Leica has this in some of their lenses. Very nice, and actually fits my Leica M10 Monochrom very, very well. Shooting with the Summilux M90 is very special, and I want to start my review after I explained what's shipped in the box with the specs sheet of that lens, and there are a few things to note. First of all, you find all kinds of technical data here which is related to the optical properties of the lens, but what is special is the minimum focus distance of 1 meter. You typically don't have this with 90mm focal length on Leica lenses, and it also allows for a higher reproduction ratio than usual on Leica lenses. So for instance, if you look up that number on the Leica Noctilux with 50mm, it will be much smaller, and if you divide 1 over 8.8 you get 11 to 12%, something like that, give or take. And that means you are getting closer to a close-up shooting situation here, which gives you a nice reproduction ratio, and you can bring nicely into scene on your image. But what I wanted to show mainly is the depth of field charts here, and that's a very interesting one. By the way, you have a depth of field table here where you can see, given any aperture stop you choose on the aperture ring and any distance setting here on the distance scale, what is your range where subjects in that range will be sharp. But that's technical. What I wanted to show are these charts here. So here you see the widest open aperture of f1.5, and on the y-axis you see the distance setting. So for instance, if you go to a focus distance of 1 meter, you see here how shallow your depth of field is. And that continues over most of the f-stops and makes it very hard to focus with that lens. And I think in general, if people are beginners, this is not a good lens to start with. First of all, it's all manual. like typically on rangefinder cameras. Also the lens is operated fully manually. And second, it's, I think, useful to have experience to get subjects sharp and in focus. And I'm not saying people cannot learn it, but it will take time before people who have never used these kind of lenses before will enjoy the beauty of shooting with that lens, because it's more difficult than with, let's say, more standard lenses. So if we go from an aperture of f1.5 to the next stop here, 2.0, basically almost nothing changes on closer distances, and that continues for a while. So let's go up to, let's say, f5.6, which for many lenses is the sweet spot. Means here you have the best image quality in terms of sharpness, corner to corner. And even here you see, if you are close to your subject at 2 meters, for instance, so here's 2 meters, it's still a very shallow depth of field. And that makes it difficult to focus with that lens. And here's actually an example where I wanted to focus from my view, my perspective, to the eye on the right hand side, but had focused then instead on the eye from my perspective on the left hand side, which is not what I wanted, because it looks not natural. And that can happen, and that's why it is also important to check after a shot whether you have the focus sitting where you wanted it to sit and not just go over to your next scene. Even if we go up to the, let's say, closest aperture here, which is f16, you still have at closer distances a comparably shallow depth of field here. And of course, if you go to higher distances here, 5 to 10 meters, then you get quite a lot of depth of field, but you have to close the aperture, and that's not what these lenses are built for. These lenses are built for shooting wide open. And I think if you purchase a lens like this for a lot of money, it's a very expensive lens, and you don't use it with wide open apertures, then it's a waste of money and a waste of opportunity. And I'm going to show a lot of sample images later where I think people will clearly see what it means to shoot with that lens. I will now show samples from a portrait shooting in Zurich, and there are many things to say and to comment, but I'll basically give the image impressions, and then we turn our attention to street. And as I said before, shooting street with 90mm focal length is very special, but based on compression, which is one of the properties telelenses create in photography, it has a very charming character. So let's get started with the samples now. So for these portraits, I have a combination now of 90mm, which in general already creates blurry backgrounds, but then all these images have been shot with apertures between f1.5, which is the widest open, and an aperture of f4. And in this particular image I placed my model next to a street light with a lot of wide open space behind her, so the background had almost no structures recognizable, so I could completely remove it and create that special look here in post-processing. So let's now look at the second set of sample images, and for many people street photography means they grab their camera, go somewhere downtown and shoot scenes which catch their attention and currently interest them. It's slightly the other way around for me. I typically hardly leave the house without a camera in my bag, and then I'm in town, and then all of a sudden I'm aware that something is going on which catches my attention, and then I shoot the scene. And that happened a weekend ago. So I was in town, I had something completely different to do, but I had my camera in my backpack, and I realized something is going on because of a lot of noise and people. And it was a Black Lives Matter demonstration, and I used the telelens to actually take some shots here. And using telelenses for street is very special because a 90mm focal length incorporates what people call compression, and compression means that the foreground and the background appear much closer together than they really are. Let's have a look at the samples now. Street photography is neutral, and neutral means you just perceive what you see. And there is something magic about photography always, because it means that moment in time when you capture that scene and that image will never come back. And if I'm doing street photography and I see something that interests me, I always ask myself, what is the story behind what I'm seeing? There are so many individuals on the streets, people moving forth and back, people who are depressed, people who are happy, people who have different motivations, different things to do, and attached to every individual, attached to every scene is a story. And as a photographer, I try to understand that story with just one snapshot on the time axis, one tiny little glimpse into those people's life. So let's wrap up and conclude the video. First of all, on the portrait side, I think this lens on the Leica M10 Monochrom did a fantastic job. I like these images a lot. Most importantly, my model likes the images a lot and can use them in her portfolio. And I think there is something magic about the new Leica Summilux 90mm f1.5 in the way it represents light, and because you have a 90mm focal length which is long in the tele area, and because you can open the aperture wide to 1.5, you get almost no structure in the background and a very blurry background and a very nice bokeh, and that means you can also distinguish and separate the foreground from the background in the way I did in the first 3 portraits you saw in my sample images. Second, on street, I should say I hardly use telelenses in my daily photography. Most of the time I shoot wide angle between 21mm and 35mm, or I use normal focal lengths like 50mm and 58mm like on the Noctilux or on the Nikon Noct. And it's probably a shame because the way telelenses are compressing the foreground and the background together can create a very special atmosphere, as we saw on those black and white pictures from the protest march. And in this way probably provide a counter argument that street photography has to be shot on wide angle lenses. If you like this video, I would be happy if you drop me your thumbs up, and if you like my channel, do not forget to subscribe to stay tuned on my content. Thanks for watching, stay safe and healthy, and peace out.